Cleopatra, one of the most important queens of ancient Egypt. She became one of the best-known women in human history, dwarfing all other women in the ancient world, portrayed over 2,000 years from many different angles. As romantic heroine and victim, as a sexual predator and cold-blooded killer, stopped at nothing when it came to gaining power. Molded according to the fashions and prejudices of each era, and creating a great myth around her figure. His story is intertwined with that of some of the most powerful men in Western history, member of the Ptolemaic dynasty and a descendant of its founder, Ptolemy I, the great general of Alexander the Great. Cleopatra was a visionary, cunning, and incredibly intelligent leader. She used all her talents to become the most feared and respected ruler of her time, risking it all for her dream of empire. Join us in this episode of our Origin series to explore everything about the spectacular and enigmatic life of Cleopatra VII.
Welcome to our channel. Discover the captivating episodes of our Origin series, for which I leave a link above, guiding you through the history of mankind in chronological order. Don't miss this incredible journey. Subscribe, like, and share to help us reach even more curious minds. Thank you.
Cleopatra VII was the last queen of ancient Egypt and the last sovereign of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She ruled Egypt between 51 and 30 before the current era. She captivated her contemporaries and has fascinated the Western world for more than 2,000 years. The Ptolemies were Macedonians, not Egyptians. Cleopatra was a descendant of Ptolemy I, who had gained control of Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great, 300 years earlier. Alexandria, Cleopatra's hometown, was an outward-facing Greek city, where native Egyptians were at the bottom of the social pyramid. In this episode, we will first explore the context of both his native Egypt and the wider Mediterranean world, the traditions of pharaonic Egypt, and the historical events that put Egypt under the control of the Ptolemies. From the first years of Cleopatra's life, within one of the bloodiest and most treacherous royal families in history, until the events that led her to take an extreme bet and join the man who had just conquered Rome to maintain the independence of her country against all odds for more than 20 years. We will also understand, through the prism of Cleopatra's reign in Egypt, the last stages of the collapse of the Roman Republic. Egypt was one of the most important civilizations of the ancient world, already towards the 3rd millennium before our era. When Western Europe was still in the Stone Age, Egypt was flourishing. The desert borders kept the invaders away, and the annual rising of the Nile offered fertile farmland. The Egyptians developed a unique island culture. It was the longest-lived civilization in human history, which prospered and grew to become an extraordinarily successful culture. I leave you a link here above to a spectacular documentary about the complete history of more than 3,000 years of the civilization of ancient Egypt. During the 500 years of the period of the New Empire, Egypt experienced great political stability and economic prosperity. But after the fall of a new empire, Egypt plunged into deep crisis and fragmentation. In 525 before the current era, it was invaded by the Persians and continued under Persian rule until 322, when Alexander the Great claimed Egypt for his empire. By the time Alexander conquered Egypt, much of the known world was already part of his empire. I also leave you a link above to the documentary that narrates the complete life of Alexander the Great, the greatest conqueror of all time. After the death of Alexander in Babylon, in June of 323, at the age of 33, the vast kingdom that he struggled to build during a period of more than 12 years, it was finally divided among more than 20 rulers. The Greek general Ptolemy, his most trusted general, inherited Egypt. After Alexander's death, Alexandria quickly became the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom and the most important Greek city in the world. Ptolemy I would be both king for the Greeks and pharaoh for the Egyptians, and would found a dynasty. This is the beginning of the Ptolemaic dynasty. There were 15 sovereigns, all of whom bore the name of Ptolemy, and they would rule Egypt through almost 300 years during the Hellenistic period, until the year 30 before the current era, at which time Egypt became a Roman province. The dynasty had several queens, including Cleopatra VII. The Ptolemaic dynasty adopted Egyptian customs from the beginning. It was a constant enemy of the Macedonian Seleucid dynasty, founded by Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals, who focused on the Middle East. Ptolemy made Alexandria the capital of Egypt. He wanted his city to be not only the capital of a powerful country, but also an enlightening center of knowledge and learning. Thanks to Ptolemy, Alexandria immediately began to attract influential scholars from all over the Greek world. Alexandria supplanted even Athens as the most important Greek city in history. General Ptolemy always promoted a good coexistence between the Greeks and the indigenous Egyptians. His heirs continued this policy, and thus, the Ptolemaic culture became cosmopolitan and dedicated to progress. To learn more about this illustrious city, don't miss the documentary on the complete history of Alexandria. The reign of the successor of Alexander the Great and founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty would be full of ostentatious power and the construction of legendary monuments. Ptolemy I would create the largest and most famous library in the world, the Great Library of Alexandria. At a time when books did not yet exist, it had up to 700,000 papyrus scrolls and would become the first research center in the ancient world. During more than 300 years in power, the Ptolemies transformed Egypt into a cultural and economic powerhouse. But the dynasty founded by Ptolemy I had a very dark side. The members of this dynasty retained control of the Egyptian throne for 300 years, being cruel and ruthless. Murders, plots, brutality, intrigues, dark deaths in the palaces. All of that was part of the daily life of this family. For the Ptolemaics, murder was a legitimate political tool, and family loyalty did not exist. Most of the Ptolemaics died violently, and almost always, another member of the family was responsible. Stories are known of children who killed their own parents, their brothers, their sisters, and in some cases, even their own children, by beheading, execution, poisoning, or even stabbing them in the back. On the other hand, for centuries, the Ptolemaics had committed incest to generate the next generation of kings and queens. All of this had to do with the idea of keeping the bloodline pure. The Ptolemaics decreed that members of the royal family should marry each other. Then, they were expected to have offspring together. Brothers marrying their sisters, sons marrying their mothers. And Cleopatra would be born in Alexandria 2.5 centuries after the reign of the founder of the dynasty in 69 before the current era, within one of the bloodiest and most treacherous royal families in history. She was the daughter of Ptolemy XII. His father, Ptolemy XII, was the son of Ptolemy IX and of an unknown mother. It was this same status as a bastard son, which meant that throughout his reign, he had to seek support in Rome to counteract that insufficient royal legitimacy. Cleopatra was the third of the 5 children of Ptolemy XII. He had 2 older sisters, Berenice IV and Cleopatra VI, his younger sister, Arsinoe IV, and 2 younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. Having grown up in this bloody family scenario, she had a very clear vision of how family politics worked. Either you killed members of your family, or you risked being killed yourself. Terrible events occurred during her childhood, which marked her forever. The constant confrontations to the death forged her strong and skillful character, which led her years later to definitively occupy the throne of Egypt, to the detriment of her own brother, Ptolemy XIII. Most of the horrible stories about Cleopatra were written by the Romans, who had little regard for her. Roman sources depict Cleopatra as a monster, a woman who wanted to take control of Rome, seducing men to do anything for her, and that nothing could stop this woman until she destroyed everything that was important to Rome. The Egypt in which Cleopatra was born was no longer the power it had been. Now, the very survival of the royal family was in danger. The future of Egypt, and that of the Ptolemaics, and even that of Cleopatra, was in the hands of a superior foreign empire. It was a world dominated by the Roman Republic. The Romans were the superpower, and Cleopatra witnessed firsthand how powerful the Romans had become. When Cleopatra was just over 10 years old, her father was overthrown in a family rebellion. In a desperate attempt to regain power, he traveled with her young daughter to Rome to ask for the money he needed to regain his throne. Possibly, she witnessed his father's plea to the Roman senators to regain his power in Egypt. Cleopatra was raised as the future queen of Egypt. She was incredibly smart, and she was very well educated. He grew up studying mathematics, philosophy, astronomy. She was a scientist who wrote poetry. She was a very resourceful young woman, and was raised in the belief that she was the best person to rule Egypt. Cleopatra's childhood tutor was Philostratus, from whom she learned the arts of oratory and Greek philosophy. During her youth, she presumably studied at the Museion. A building that also included the Library of Alexandria, the most famous in ancient history. Ancient Alexandria was not only the most modern city of its time, but also the center of world knowledge. Built to house all human knowledge, the library was the world's first research center. For hundreds of years, Alexandria had invited dignitaries from all over the world to study in its halls. It was the most important place of learning in the ancient world. There, the greatest minds of the time taught and conducted research. Intellectual advances, new philosophies, new sciences, were a driving force in the city. Cleopatra was already able to speak several languages before reaching adulthood. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language. She also spoke Ethiopic, Troglodyte, Hebrew or Aramaic, Arabic, Syrian, Median, Parthian, and Latin. In 65 before the current era, the Roman censor, Marcus Licinius Crassus, argued before the Roman Senate that Rome should annex the Ptolemaic Egypt. Ptolemy, seeking the support of Rome, sent troops to help the consul in general, Pompey the Great, in Palestine. Cicero, representing Pompey's interests, persuaded the Senate to oppose Roman annexation. Ptolemy XII responded to the threat of possible annexation by offering remunerations and lavish gifts to powerful Roman statesmen. Ptolemy's wasteful behavior went bankrupt and was forced to obtain loans from Roman bankers. During his reign, Egypt became a virtual client kingdom of the Roman Republic. This must have affected Cleopatra's way of thinking, who on the one hand had been instilled in her that she belonged to an extraordinary culture with extraordinary potential. But on the other hand, she understood at that moment that those who really had the power were the Romans. Faced with serious opposition from the people of Alexandria, and still unsure of his status in Rome, Ptolemy bribed Julius Caesar, one of the Roman consuls of the year 59 before our era, in exchange for which Caesar passed a law recognizing his kingship. Cleopatra was 10 years old when her father sealed the deal with Caesar. Over the next decade, with the help of her father's great gifts, Caesar's army would sweep Gaul away in a spectacular conquest, which guaranteed his future in Rome. However, Rome stripped Egypt of Cyprus the following year. The loss of Cyprus and Ptolemy's submissive attitude towards Rome outraged the people of Alexandria. They expelled Ptolemy from Egypt and accepted its queen Tryphena and his older daughter, Berenice IV, as rulers in the year 58 before the current era. Ptolemy XII was thus forced to leave Egypt and flee to Rome, along with his 11-year-old daughter, Cleopatra. In order not to lose the family tradition, shortly after, Cleopatra's sister, Berenice IV, strangled her husband and would have murdered her mother, seizing the throne of Egypt. In the year 55 before the current era, after promising the payment of 10,000 talents to Pompey's lieutenant, Ptolemy was returned to Egypt with a Roman army. This time, a young officer, Mark Antony, led the Roman ordeal, which helped restore Cleopatra's father to the Egyptian throne. Once restored to the throne, he executed his daughter Berenice IV, who had led the opposition in Alexandria. Witnessing her own sister's murder must have had a profound psychological effect on Cleopatra. She realized that life was worth little, and that you had to accumulate power at all costs, even if that meant killing members of your own family. The respect for her father made Cleopatra her faithful favorite. As he prepared her to assume power, he instilled in Cleopatra her desire to protect what remained of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Shortly before his death, in 51 before the current era, he proclaimed his daughter, Cleopatra VII, and his eldest son, Coreges. It is likely, but not proven, that the two married shortly after their father's death. Soon Cleopatra, aged 18, 8 years older than her brother, became the dominant ruler. But as a Ptolemaic, Cleopatra knew that being a monarch was no guarantee of safety. It was the dominant theme of her entire life: fear. Cleopatra was afraid of a sudden and violent end at the hands of her own family. She had to deal with several pressing problems and emergencies shortly after ascending the throne, such as a famine caused by a drought due to a low level of the annual Nile flood, and the anarchic behavior of the Gabinianes, the soldiers of the Roman garrison of Gabinius, who remained in Egypt. Extensive bribery from Ptolemy XII had left Egypt in financial trouble. Cleopatra inherited her father's debts. Egypt owed the Roman Republic 17 million drachmas. The teenage queen found herself at the center of a struggle for power and survival. Her rival in Nuco region was her brother Ptolemy XIII. Despite being just a boy, he was now a match for Cleopatra. In Egypt, only the king had power, but being a minor, the young Ptolemy reigned with his advisors. Following the Ptolemaic tradition of family infighting, Cleopatra and her brother became deadly opponents. Cleopatra soon lost her temper, faced with her brother's weakness and ineffectiveness. She considered herself the most suitable person to rule Egypt. It was a dispute that quickly turned into a battle for survival. Cleopatra's brother may have been just a boy, but he was surrounded by power and hungry advisors, eager to take advantage of his position. They quickly made sure that Ptolemy had the support of the court and the army, and began to press for the downfall of the tenacious young queen. Her brother, along with his advisors, convinced the people that Cleopatra was guilty of the recent drought. During her government, the queen tried to maintain political ties with Rome. She began to strengthen friendly ties with the Romans, who could become important allies in the event of a civil war in Egypt. Her main ally would be General Pompey, leader of one of the most traditional Roman families. Such diplomatic maneuvers led Cleopatra to be accused of treason for conspiring against her brother. But at that moment, the rivalry was so important that one of the brothers would end up killing the other. Cleopatra's best chance of survival was to flee the palace and the city. At the age of 21, the young ruler had to leave Alexandria and went into exile in Syria, where an army was established and raised. For a year, Cleopatra lived in exile, plotting the time when she could return and reclaim her crown. This could have been the end of the queen, but for one exception. Both Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy were now pawns at a global game. Rome had its sights set on Egypt. The young Egyptian king and his 3 advisors decided to go in search of the queen to prevent her return to Alexandria at any cost. At the time of their search, they found the unexpected news that Pompey, who rivaled the great Julius Caesar, was on his way to Egyptian lands. A conflict divided the Roman Empire between Pompey and Julius Caesar. This conflict became known as the Caesarian Civil War. It was after suffering a disastrous defeat in Greece against Julius Caesar that a fearful Pompey fled to Egypt for refuge. Cleopatra's hope of regaining her throne was to forge an alliance with Rome. She then identified a Roman who was powerful enough to match her as an ally. That Roman was Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the world at the time, with vast armies at his disposal. But Cleopatra's brother first met Caesar during the visit of the Roman general to Egypt in 48 before the current era. He had gone to collect the large sums of money that Egypt owed Rome. At that time, the young pharaoh committed a big mistake. Sometime before, wanting to make a good impression on Caesar, Ptolemy had Pompey, Caesar's Roman rival, beheaded upon his arrival in Alexandria. When Caesar appeared before Ptolemy, the latter presented Pompey's head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar was shocked and horrified by the audacity of these foreigners to kill one of the great Romans at the time. Caesar, enraged, and ordered the execution of the man who had killed his rival. He demanded the rest of the debt of the pact he had sealed with the father of the young pharaoh. This serious mistake of the young Ptolemy became the perfect opportunity for Cleopatra in exile. Then Caesar announced that he would personally resolve the controversy between Cleopatra and her brother and summon them both. With her audacity, Cleopatra plotted the next move. She secretly returned to the palace, hidden in a rolled-up rug. She was led to Caesar's room, who became her lover. The next morning, young Ptolemy arrived at the arranged meeting and found Caesar and his sister together. Surprised by Cleopatra's success with Caesar, Ptolemy threw down his crown and withdrew. Caesar mediated between the brothers in the hope of reaching a peaceful solution. The calm did not last long. During a banquet celebrating the reconciliation, there was an attempt to assassinate Caesar. The Roman leader's own barber was the one who thwarted the attack. When it was discovered that Pothinus, the king's regent, had been the organizer of the attack, Caesar ordered his execution and put the young king under surveillance. While the young king was detained in a royal palace, the Cleopatra's brothers' supporters rose up against the queen and her Roman lover. While the uprising of Ptolemy's supporters was brewing, Caesar had the opportunity to lead a pilgrimage to the tomb of his hero, Alexander the Great, located in the excavated burial chamber on the rock behind Solna's mausoleum. There, accompanied by Cleopatra, he paid his respects at Alexander's tomb. Meanwhile, General Achilles, answering to Ptolemy, gathered a host of 20,000 infantry and 2,000 horsemen who marched down the city. Thus began, in 47 before the current era, the siege of Alexandria. Caesar had no strength to oppose and sent ambassadors to negotiate. Achilles executed them on the spot and eliminated any possibility of peace. Caesar, trapped in the palace with just 4,000 soldiers and knowing that the arrival of the enemy army was imminent, asked for help from Syria, Rhodes, and Cilicia. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, escaped from Alexandria with her trusted eunuch, Ganymede, and joined the army of Achilles, becoming the leader of the resistance against the Roman invaders, since Cleopatra was on their side and Ptolemy XIV was only 12 years old. The situation was complex, and Caesar ordered the ships in the port to be burned to avoid temptations to retreat, a process during which the flames spread to the famous Alexandrian library, destroying it. Achilles took control of the city, except for the last pocket of resistance, whose fall seemed imminent. And then, a stroke of luck cleared things up a bit for Caesar. Ganymede had a serious confrontation with Achilles, and Arsinoe ordered the execution of the latter, naming Ganymede as general. But, at the beginning of the year 47, Caesar's long-awaited relief forces finally appeared, marching from Asia Minor. With this, the situation took a turn, and in March of 47, the Egyptians were defeated, caught between two fronts, and the Roman legions became the official protection of the queen. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, capsizing his boat while fleeing. And Ganymede suffered a similar fate. Arsinoe was taken prisoner, but her life was spared. Subsequently, Cleopatra had to share the throne with her surviving and harmless younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. This co-government had the blessing of Caesar. Then Cleopatra would become pregnant with Caesar's son, Caesarion, who would represent the union between two of the largest nations in the world. From there, Cleopatra began to present herself in Egypt as the living incarnation of one of the most powerful deities, Isis. And the point would come when Cleopatra would feel safe enough to take her son Caesarion to visit Rome. In the year 46 before our hero, Cleopatra made her entry into Rome preceded by Julius Caesar. It was a triumphant arrival, which was accompanied by the jubilation of the Romans for having achieved Caesar's victory in Alexandria against Cleopatra's opponents, and the end of hostilities between the two territories. The visit would serve for Caesar to get to know his son, but mainly to strengthen the pact between Cleopatra and Caesar, since he was preparing his campaign and needed the resources of Egypt. For Cleopatra and for Caesar, the visit had a great political and personal meaning, but it was also a huge public relations disaster. Rome was intrigued and at the same time horrified by Cleopatra, and the situation worsened every day. Julius Caesar placed the statue of her in the Temple of Venus. In the eyes of the Romans, Cleopatra was just a barbarian queen who had come from her troubled Egyptian lands. With her sensual, immoral ways, and contrary to everything that was good in Rome, a threat to the very foundations of the Roman society. She represented everything they feared and hated. Mistrust in Rome towards the Egyptian queen intensified when Caesar began to act like a king. But by March 44 before the current era, Caesar's level of unpopularity was very high in Rome. The distrust of the Senate towards Caesar was also very high. A large group of senators thought that the freedom of the Republic was at stake, and that the fate that awaited Rome was to end up as part of a new cosmopolitan empire ruled from Alexandria. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar entered the Roman Senate, since he had been summoned to the Forum so that the Senate would read him a petition in order to return the effective power to the Senate. Mark Antony, who had had vague news of the possibility of a plot, rushed to the Forum and attempted to stop Caesar on the stairs, but was pinned down while trying to catch him up. But the group of conspirators intercepted Caesar just as he passed Pompey's Theater, where the Roman Curia was meeting, and led him to a room off the east porch, where the petition was handed to him. Within minutes, the Senate, the epicenter of power and the most sophisticated civilization on Earth, was plunged into sheer savagery. Julius Caesar was stabbed to death 23 times. The victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by a group of senators opposed to his autocratic ambitions. Suddenly, everything fell apart for Cleopatra. If Caesar's enemies ruled Rome, she would be on the wrong side. All the security that she had sought so much was gone, and Cleopatra had to start over. She stayed there for almost a whole month. To ensure her future safety, that of her son and her country, Cleopatra had to find a new ally in Rome. She needed help to prevent the Romans from invading Egypt and stealing its riches. That's when a politician, general, and Caesar's most faithful ally appears: Mark Antony. For the second time in her life, Cleopatra would need to use all the abilities at her disposal, but this time she would do so in a more immoral way. When Caesar was alive, she set her sights on his replacement, the new co-ruler of the Roman Empire, Mark Antony. He would be Cleopatra's next conquest. An alliance with this powerful general seemed like her best chance for survival. Cleopatra remained in Rome until mid-April, in the vain hope that Caesar would be recognized as Caesar's heir. However, in his will, Caesar named his great-nephew, Octavian, as the main heir. Cleopatra's return to Alexandria in May 44, after the assassination of Caesar, marks the second part of her reign, in which she made notable progress in restoring the empire of her ancestors. Ptolemy XIV died in 44. It is likely that Cleopatra ordered his assassination when he became a threat. Cleopatra then ruled with her youngest son, Ptolemy XV Caesarion. With Caesarion as king, Cleopatra got to work, finishing the restoration work in Alexandria. Among her most famous developments is the Temple of Isis on the island of Pharos. She finished the works that his father had left half in Edfu and began the construction of the Caesareum, a temple in honor of Caesar, imitating the Roman Forum and near the port of the city. Also, she built a floating altar in Hermontis and a synagogue. On the intellectual level, the queen herself also applied her resurrecting skills, and Alexandria experienced an intellectual rebirth. During the years 44 to 41, before the current era, Cleopatra dedicated herself to reigning in Egypt, but without losing sight of the civil war in Rome. When Caesar's assassins were defeated in the year 42 in the Battle of Philippi, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus became Caesar's heirs. They then decided to divide the Republic into 3 parts to administer it jointly. Antony received Gaul, Greece, and the East. Lepidus received Africa. And Octavian took control of Hispania and Rome. So Antony, now controller of Rome's eastern territories, sent for Cleopatra so she could explain her role after Caesar's assassination. In 41 before Christ, Cleopatra set sail to meet Mark Antony and his palace in the eastern Mediterranean with the aim of exploiting all of Mark Antony's weaknesses and conquering him. Antony knew that Cleopatra would try to dupe him, and she knew that he wanted all of Egypt's resources to finance his military campaigns. But it was all part of the game. For Cleopatra, it was a game of life and death, and she was actually negotiating for her life, her sons, and the independence of Egypt. For Cleopatra, there were no boundaries between business and pleasure. Mark Antony would become the love of her life and the cause of her death. After the meeting, Mark Antony was captivated, forgetting his wife Fulvia, who in Italy was doing everything possible to maintain her husband's interests in the face of the growing threat of the young Octavian. Antony returned to Alexandria, where he treated Cleopatra not as a protected sovereign, but as an independent monarch. Cleopatra's seduction of Antony began as a calculating political move. But within weeks, passion had engulfed politics. In Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony formed a society, the members of which lived what some historians have interpreted as a life of debauchery and madness. Having eliminated her brother, Cleopatra's holy threat within her own family was her sister, Arsinoe. Her sister was in exile in the lands of present-day Turkey, beyond the reach of Cleopatra, but not beyond the reach of Antony's soldiers. Arsinoe, her only surviving sister, was killed on the orders of Mark Antony. At 28 years old, and her brothers dead, Cleopatra had the absolute power she had sought all her life. With her son and heir, Caesar Ion, to continue her dynasty. But Cleopatra was represented by the Romans as an alcoholic, something so frowned upon as an oriental tyrant or prostitute. Cleopatra's romance with Antony was the perfect ammunition for his rival in the Roman Senate, Octavian. At just 22 years old, Octavian shared the power of the Roman Empire with Mark Antony in an uneasy alliance. In Alexandria, intoxicated and in love, Cleopatra and Antony were oblivious to the growing storm of Rome and blind to the growing threat of Octavian. But Cleopatra wanted more. The queen's ambition led her to dream of building her own empire, inspired by the man buried in the center of Alexandria, Alexander the Great. Alexander's lost empire was Cleopatra's inspiration. Rebuilding it became the obsession of her life. But Cleopatra's imperial plan depended on Antony keeping control of Rome. But while Antony was partying in Alexandria, he had been losing more and more influence in the Roman Senate, while Octavian was increasing his, plotting against Mark Antony. In early 40 before the current era, after spending several months in Alexandria, Antony finally heeded the warning signs and returned to Rome, leaving Cleopatra pregnant. In the year 40, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Cleopatra was willing to abandon her personal needs to achieve her political dreams, even if it meant letting Mark Antony go and marry another woman. Antony was forced to conclude a temporary agreement with Octavian. As part of this agreement, he married Octavian's sister. 3 years later, Antony was convinced that he and Octavian could never reach an agreement. Then, he returned to the east and met with Cleopatra. Antony needed Cleopatra's financial support for his postponed Parthian campaign. In exchange, Cleopatra requested the return of much of Egypt's eastern empire, including large portions of Syria and Lebanon, and even the rich balsam groves of Jericho. The Parthian campaign was a costly failure, as was the temporary conquest of Armenia. However, in 34, Antony celebrated a triumphant return to Alexandria. He proclaimed Caesar Ion as Caesar's son, thus relegating Octavian, who had been adopted by Caesar as his son and heir, to legal illegitimacy. Cleopatra was hailed as Queen of Kings, Caesar Ion as King of Kings. Alexander Helios was awarded Armenia and the territory beyond the Euphrates to his little brother, Ptolemy, the lands to the west. The children's sister, Cleopatra Selene, was to be ruler of Cyrene. It was clear to Octavian, watching from Rome, that Antony intended his extended family to rule the civilized world. For the Romans, the idea that those parts of their empire were given to a foreign queen was an act of aggression, an attack on the authority of Rome. For Octavian, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. Octavian, a master of political propaganda, turned the opinion of Rome against Cleopatra. In 31 before the current era, the Roman Senate, controlled by Octavian, declared that Antony had become a public enemy and declared war on Cleopatra. Octavian called Cleopatra a dangerous foreign aggressor, a threat to Rome itself, and saw this as an opportunity to attack Egypt. Rumors quickly spread that Antony also intended to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria. The naval battle of Actium, in which Octavian faced the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra on September of 31, was a disaster for the Egyptians. After several defeats of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Octavian's legions approached Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, and Cleopatra retreated to her mausoleum as Antony left to fight his last battle. At this time, Cleopatra's son was taken by Octavian as a threat to Rome. So several days before Octavian arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra sent her son to Ethiopia for his own protection. Octavian's maritime victory at Actium resulted in the end of the contest between Caesar's two heirs. After Actium, the consort set out to follow Cleopatra, heading for the lands of the Nile. The rest of the fleet and army of Antony and Cleopatra joined Octavian, who now numbered about 50 legions. It was the following year, in August 30th, that the victorious heir arrived in Alexandria, accompanied by a large number of troops. Finding herself cornered and behind Antony's back, Cleopatra made Octavian an offer. Ancient historians believe that Cleopatra would have suggested to Octavian that she would give him Egypt in exchange for the security of a nation and that of her son. But Octavian didn't want Cleopatra's money. He wanted his country, with all its riches, for himself. Later, Antony received the false news that Cleopatra had died, spread by Cleopatra herself, and knowing that this would cause Antony to commit suicide. And finally, Mark Antony fell on his sword and committed suicide. Octavian and his legions took the city, overcoming the small number of Cleopatra's troops. The queen realized that her only way out was death, but was determined that if she died, it would not be at Octavian's hands. Octavian, for his part, was now in control of Egypt and had placed Cleopatra under arrest. But Octavian not only wanted to defeat Cleopatra, he wanted to humiliate her, parade her through the streets of Rome like a piece of plunder, dragging her through the streets. Cleopatra finally realized that her dream of keeping Egypt independent, creating a new empire, and giving her children a future had died. Life thus lost all meaning for her. After Octavian's capture of Alexandria, Cleopatra went to the royal palace. Upon entering the palace, he was smuggled in an aspid, a poisonous snake native to Egypt, in a basket. That day, After Octavian's arrival at the royal palace, the Queen of the Nile declared herself to Octavian as a friend at Hawaii of Rome, hoping that this would help her in her situation. But the meeting ultimately went nowhere. At that time, Cleopatra would have promised to accompany Octavian to Rome. When Octavian withdrew from the royal palace, he left the queen in custody. But according to Plutarch's writings, Cleopatra managed to lock herself in a mausoleum she had built in the palace of Alexandria, accompanied by 2 of her servants and with the Egyptian cobra that had been sent to her in a basket. Then, dressed in her formal clothes and jewelry, the queen seized the wriggling aspid, and after sending Octavian a note about her burial requests, brought the snake to her bare chest and killed herself. In this way, on August of the 30 before the current era, 11 days after the death of Mark Antony, Cleopatra, at 39 years old, decided to take her own life. Her suicide was a blow to Octavian, who was unable to complete his plan for Cleopatra. In revenge, Octavian destroyed everything Cleopatra had fought for. Her nation was annexed to the Roman Empire. Her beloved Caesar Ion, the object of all her hopes and dreams, was assassinated. Her children with Mark Antony disappeared. Cleopatra had died. Egypt became just another province of the empire. The Egypt Cleopatra fought for, a civilization dating back thousands of years, was Gala. Octavian later became the first Roman emperor and ended up being one of the most renowned and representative figures of antiquity. Cleopatra was a cunning and visionary leader, a woman who managed to dominate the world at a time when the power game was only for men, a loving mother and a multiple murderer, a ruthless politician and an extravagant hedonist. She used all her talents to become the most feared and respected ruler of her time. She risked it all for the dream of an empire, only to see it fall by supporting the wrong man. Cleopatra paid with her life for her failure, but with her death, her legend was born. A fascinating legend, that of a woman who shook the foundations of the Roman Empire. Today, 2,000 years after her death, that legend lives on.